law firms on retainer. I don't know how much money is coming in, but I know that a lot of money is going out every single month.
What if I told you the most explosive part of that Netflix documentary was the part you were never allowed to see? Because everyone watched it. Everyone reacted to it. Everyone thought they saw the full story about Diddy, Tupac, and the industry behind it all. But behind the scenes, something strange happened. A key witness, Katt Williams, allegedly gave testimony that directly touched on Shakur, power, and industry secrets, and yet, when the final edit dropped, every second of that footage was gone. Not trimmed, not shortened, completely erased. And here's the question that changes everything. Why? Because this wasn't a random cut. This wasn't a mistake. This was a decision. Somebody watched that footage and said, "This cannot be released." Now think about that. Diddy is already in prison. His voice is gone. He can't defend himself. He can't speak. He can't influence anything from behind bars. So if he's silenced, then who still has enough power to silence someone else's testimony after the cameras stopped rolling? And even more disturbing, the documentary was executive produced by 50 Cent, a man who has spent years publicly attacking Diddy, calling him out, exposing him, building his entire media brand on that conflict. So why would that same project remove a witness that could have made everything worse for Diddy? Was it legal pressure? Brand protection? Or something deeper nobody is saying out loud? Because once you realize a finished documentary can still be edited before you see it, you start questioning everything. What else didn't make the final cut? And more importantly, who decided what truth you were allowed to see? So let's pick up right where that question lands. Who decided what truth you were allowed to see? Because once you start digging into this situation, it stops looking like a simple documentary edit and starts looking like something much more controlled, much more intentional. According to the claims being circulated, Katt Williams didn't just give a casual interview. He allegedly gave direct testimony-style commentary that touched on Tupac Shakur, industry power structures, and long-running rumors that have followed certain names for decades. And then silence. Not silence from Katt Williams. Silence from the final product. The footage was reportedly there. Cameras rolled. Questions were asked. Answers were given. And then, before release, it was gone. Now in the real world of documentaries, cutting footage is normal. Interviews get trimmed. Scenes get shortened. Narratives get tightened for pacing. But this situation, as described by online commentators, doesn't feel like editing for pacing. It feels like editing for protection. Because the specific angle people are reacting to isn't just that Katt Williams was removed. It's what he was allegedly talking about. Anything connected to Tupac Shakur instantly raises the stakes. This isn't just entertainment history anymore. It's cultural trauma, unsolved theories, and decades of unanswered questions that still follow hip-hop's biggest names. So when a witness is removed from a narrative that already sits on that kind of pressure, people start asking different questions. Not, why was it cut for time? But, who didn't want this in the final version? And that's where things get even more complicated. Because the documentary itself is not being viewed as a neutral project. It is being dissected through its ownership, its production choices, and the people involved in shaping the final cut. Executive production credits matter here. Because the moment a high-profile figure is attached to a project, every edit starts to look like a decision made under influence. And in this case, critics are pointing toward one major contradiction: a project that is publicly positioned as revealing or exposing something, allegedly removing one of the most unpredictable voices in entertainment. Katt Williams is not someone who sticks to a controlled script. He is known for improvisation, sharp commentary, and statements that often sit outside industry comfort zones. So when a voice like that disappears from a documentary centered around one of the most sensitive topics in music history, the absence becomes louder than the presence. And that's exactly what has fueled this entire online reaction. Now, stepping back for a second, let's separate what is fact from what is speculation. Fact: documentaries get edited before release. Fact: interviews are sometimes cut for legal reasons, clarity, or narrative focus. Fact: high-profile productions often undergo legal review before distribution. But what people are reacting to here is not just editing. It's the specific removal of a controversial voice in a controversial topic involving powerful names. That combination is what creates suspicion. Because once trust breaks in a narrative like this, viewers don't assume creative choice anymore. They assume control, and control is the word that keeps coming back in discussions. Who controls the story? Who controls the edit? Who controls what the public gets to see? And, maybe most importantly, who benefits from certain voices not being heard? These are the questions circulating in commentary spaces, not because there is confirmed proof of wrongdoing, but because the pattern of omission feels too intentional for some viewers to ignore. And while all of this is being debated online, another layer is added to the conversation: timing. Because the documentary didn't exist in a vacuum. It dropped into an environment already filled with ongoing legal narratives, resurfaced allegations, and renewed public interest in past hip-hop controversies. That means every frame of content was already going to be scrutinized. Every inclusion would be analyzed. And every exclusion would be questioned. So when Katt Williams' segment disappears, it doesn't just feel like a cut. It feels like a missing puzzle piece in a picture people are already trying to decode. And that's where the emotional side of this kicks in. Because audiences don't just consume documentaries anymore. They investigate them. They replay clips. They compare statements. They build timelines. So when something expected is missing, it doesn't fade away. It grows. It becomes the center of discussion. It becomes the conspiracy fuel. And in this case, the removal of a single voice has created a ripple effect that now stretches far beyond the documentary itself. It's now tied to questions about industry power, narrative control, and whether certain stories are ever fully allowed to be told in mainstream platforms. But here's the critical point people often overlook. Absence is not proof of conspiracy. Absence is just absence. However, in high-profile cases involving cultural icons, legal history, and unresolved public curiosity, absence rarely stays neutral. It becomes interpretation. And interpretation spreads faster than fact. So now the conversation has shifted away from what was shown to what might have been hidden. And that shift is exactly what keeps this story alive online. Because as long as people believe there is more footage, more testimony, or more truth sitting behind an editing decision, the story is not finished. It's just paused. Picking up right from there. Because once a story is paused, the next question is simple: what is it being paused for? And that's where the conversation shifts from documentary editing into something much more uncomfortable: pressure, influence, and control behind the scenes. Now again, nothing here is officially proven. But online commentary is not treating this as a normal production discussion anymore. It's being treated like a power map. Because when people look at a finished documentary and then discover a major interview segment is missing, they don't just ask, why was it cut? They start asking, who benefits from it being gone? And in this case, the suspicion starts with the structure of how high-profile documentaries are made. Even when a project has a strong public-facing name attached to it, the reality is far more layered. There are legal teams, clearance departments, platform executives, insurance requirements, and internal review processes that all have a say in what survives to release. So on paper, a cut segment could be explained in a dozen normal ways. Legal risk concerns defamation exposure, insufficient verification of claims, editorial focus tightening, tone mismatch with final narrative. But what fuels the speculation here is not the existence of editing. It's the specific nature of what was allegedly removed. Because Katt Williams is not a standard interview subject. He is a wild-card voice, someone known for unpredictable commentary, industry criticism, and statements that often live outside of controlled messaging. And in sensitive subject matter like Tupac Shakur and long-standing industry controversies, even a single uncontrolled statement can trigger legal or reputational concerns. So critics of the documentary theory argue one thing: this could have been removed purely for legal protection. But the counterargument being pushed online is very different. If it was just legal protection, why was it filmed in the first place? That question changes everything. Because production teams typically vet sensitive interviews before they ever reach the final stage. If someone is deemed too risky, They're often not included heavily in the final cut, or their segment is heavily structured and reviewed early. So the idea that a fully recorded testimony was later removed after completion is what creates the tension in the narrative. Now let's talk about the second layer people keep bringing up: production influence. Whenever a major public figure is involved in a documentary's production, even indirectly, audiences start analyzing editorial pattern, not because they assume wrongdoing automatically, but because history has taught viewers that storytelling in media is rarely neutral. It is shaped. And shaping requires selection. Selection requires omission. And omission always raises questions. So when viewers see a powerful, controversial subject like Diddy connected to a documentary, and then see a missing voice that could potentially complicate the narrative further, they start connecting dots, whether those dots are officially connected or not. And this is where things get even more emotionally charged. Because Tupac Shakur is not just another case file in pop culture. He represents a decades-long unresolved story that still carries emotional weight for fans, artists, and communities. So any suggestion that a voice related to that story was removed hits differently. It doesn't feel like editing anymore. It feels like erasure. And that word carries power. Now, on the production side, there is another important reality people often ignore. Even if a segment is filmed, it doesn't mean it survives multiple review stages. A documentary can go through first assembly cut, legal review cut, executive review cut, platform compliance review, final broadcast cut. At any of these stages, segments can be removed for reasons that have nothing to do with conspiracy, but everything to do with risk management. However, the public rarely sees those layers. They only see the final version. And the final version becomes the only version that exists in public memory. That gap between what was recorded and what was released is where speculation grows. Because humans don't like missing information. We fill gaps with narratives. And in this case, the narrative being built online is centered around a single idea, that something too sensitive was said, and someone decided it could not survive release. But even that theory runs into another contradiction. If something was truly explosive enough to require removal, why not publicly acknowledge the cut? Why not explain it as legal precaution? Why not address it directly to prevent speculation? Instead, silence creates space. And in media environments, silence is never empty. It gets interpreted. Now, let's step back and look at the role of public perception. Because once a documentary releases, it is no longer controlled by its creators. It becomes a public artifact, and audiences begin dissecting it like evidence. They compare interviews. They rewatch clips. They cross-reference old statements. They build timelines. And in that process, missing pieces become just as important as visible ones. That is exactly what is happening here. Katt Williams' absence is now functioning like a ghost segment, something people believe exists, even though they cannot see it. And psychologically, that is powerful. Because a missing piece suggests hidden knowledge. Hidden knowledge suggests intention. And intention suggests power. So the story evolves from a cut interview into a controlled narrative. Whether that is accurate or not becomes secondary to how strongly it is believed. And once belief takes hold, it spreads faster than clarification ever can. Now there is another angle that fuels this entire discussion, the idea of timing and context. Because this documentary did not release into a neutral environment. It released into a world already filled with ongoing discussions about past conflicts, industry behavior, and resurfaced allegations involving major figures. So every inclusion and exclusion was already going to be analyzed under a microscope. That means even a normal editorial decision could be interpreted as strategic. And strategic decisions, in the public eye, often get reinterpreted as intentional messaging. Which brings us to the core tension of this entire situation. Is this a case of standard documentary editing being misread through a conspiracy lens? Or is it an example of how modern media is so tightly controlled that even omissions feel deliberate? The answer depends on perspective. But what cannot be denied is this. Once viewers believe information was removed, the credibility of the full story is already compromised in their eyes. And that is the real impact here. Not what was shown, but what people now believe was hidden. So after that explosive opening claim that a finished Netflix documentary was allegedly edited to remove key testimony, the story immediately shifts into something deeper than just entertainment or media editing. Because now the question is no longer what was shown. It becomes, what was deliberately removed? And according to the claims circulating online and within commentary circles, one of the most controversial names tied to that missing footage is Katt Williams. Now here's where things start to get even more intense. The allegation being pushed is that Katt Williams allegedly gave recorded testimony referencing Tupac Shakur, testimony that was fully captured during filming, but never made it into the final cut. And if that claim is even partially accurate, it raises a serious issue, because documentaries are supposed to preserve perspective, not erase it. But instead, we are told the footage existed, cameras were rolling, statements were made, and then silence. A full deletion from the final version. No explanation. No public clarification. Just gone. And that gap becomes the center of this entire controversy. Because once you remove a voice from a story like this, especially a voice connected to one of the most debated figures in hip-hop history, people don't just forget it. They start asking why it disappeared. And that's exactly what happens here. The narrative being built suggests that the removal was not random editing, but a deliberate decision made during post-production. And that leads into the second layer of the story, power. Because the documentary itself was not just any independent project. It had heavyweight backing, high-profile production involvement, and strong creative control behind the scenes. Which means every cut, every deletion, every final edit would have had to go through multiple levels of approval. So the question becomes unavoidable. If Katt Williams' testimony was harmless, why remove it? And if it wasn't harmless, then what exactly did it contain? Now, the claims escalate further. Some commentary sources allege that the removed footage touched on sensitive connections involving industry figures and past controversies surrounding Tupac Shakur's case. But it's important to be clear here, none of this is officially verified in any court record. This entire narrative exists in the realm of allegations, commentary breakdowns, and online investigation culture. Still, the discussion keeps growing. Because the silence around the removal is louder than the removal itself. And then comes the next turning point in the narrative. Diddy. At this stage in the story, the documentary angle begins to intersect with real-world legal developments involving Sean Diddy Combs, who, according to public records and reporting in 2025, faced federal convictions related to Mann Act violations and received a prison sentence. That part is not speculation. That is part of the documented legal timeline. But what happens next is where commentary and interpretation take over. Because the argument being made in these viral breakdowns is not just about Diddy's conviction. It's about influence. Even while incarcerated, the narrative suggests that his name continues to appear in discussions surrounding older, unresolved cultural mysteries, particularly anything connected to Tupac Shakur. And this is where the story starts to blend legal fact with media theory. Because if someone is already in prison, already convicted, already removed from public power, then why does their name still appear in decisions allegedly made inside a separate Netflix production? That contradiction fuels the entire theory. Now the documentary's editing choices are being interpreted as something larger than storytelling. Now, while this documentary controversy unfolds in the media space, another parallel storyline is developing in the legal world, involving delays, evidence discussions, and ongoing proceedings connected to historical cases tied to Tupac Shakur's legacy narrative. And even though these are separate systems, media and law, the internet connects them instantly. Because once a name becomes symbolic, it stops belonging to one case. It becomes part of every case. And that is exactly what has happened here. So by the end of this first segment, the viewer is left with three core ideas. First, a testimony was allegedly recorded and then removed. Second, the reason for that removal has never been publicly clarified. And third, the names connected to the story are already embedded in larger cultural and legal conversations that refuse to disappear. And that is where part one leaves us. Not with answers, but with a growing list of questions that nobody inside the official narrative is directly addressing. And in the next part, the situation escalates further because we move from what was allegedly removed to who might have benefited from it being removed in the first place.